Hey everybody, it's ItsKindaBernt. I'm kinda burnt. I don't know about you, but 2009 feels like it was forever ago. 13 years if my basic math skills are what they should be. But yeah, that's how long ago the original Avatar came out in theaters and more or less changed filmmaking. That sounds hyperbolic, but the technology involved with making that film really did change the landscape in a lot of ways. But also, it became sort of a part of the zeitgeist. It became one of the biggest films in history, and for its time, it was the biggest film in history. James Cameron had already made Titanic a few years before, obviously, and that had been the number one movie in history for a bit. And to be James Cameron and surpass his own movie to be number one, that's quite a feat, regardless of how you feel about the movie. I do have fond memories of that movie. I do remember seeing it multiple times in theaters, sometimes with family, and how some family members who were skeptical or at best just kind of indifferent to going to the movies would put on these 3D glasses that otherwise wouldn't have been caught dead wearing and just completely become enamored and immersed in this world that James Cameron had created, who had been creating this world for the better part of his career. I just recently got my hands on the original script/treatment for that film, the original version of Avatar, and I have yet to read it. But just to know that he has been working on it for decades, it's quite something. Having said all of that, I really like Avatar, but I don't love Avatar. And it's not for all the popular reasons necessarily that people criticize the movie for. I think the whole nonsense about it being Pocahontas in space or Dances with Wolves in space is just kind of reductive and sort of misunderstands a lot of things about storytelling, but that's another episode altogether. Point is, James Cameron is not the first person to reskin a previous story and set it somewhere else in order to make a salient point. Whether or not he was successful, we can agree to disagree. But for what it's worth, the movie, I do still believe, deserves its place in history for pushing CGI the way that it did, 3D technology, motion capture, all the things that it did, but also it's a timeless, important message about respecting the planet, respecting people, respecting life in general. But as a film itself, there are some problems I have with it. And that is exactly what I was afraid would happen to me going into Avatar: The Way of Water, a sequel that a lot of people seem to agree, at least initially, the world didn't need. Again, it has been over a decade since we had seen this world, and a lot of people weren't sure that the world cared that much. A lot of people were very vocally against a sequel coming out in the first place. What reasons would we have to go back to Pandora and see these people? It seemed like the movie had said all it needed to say, and where could you possibly take the premise? But also, it seemed to a lot of people that the bubble had popped and that there was no real reason to return because there weren't any people really champing at the bit wanting to go back. So it's been surprising for some people to see that the movie has already surpassed $1 billion and is not showing any signs of slowing down. I believe I just read that it's in its third week and the attendance has actually gone up 7%, which is incredible. Oftentimes when a movie is in theaters, the viewership goes down, not up. But obviously there's a lot of people going to see this movie and there's a lot to be seen. There's a lot of people who could be called Avatar fans and we're waiting to see this sequel after years of waiting for it to occur. So is it any good? Is it worth your time? Was it worth Disney's investment in it when they bought Fox and ended up with that property under the Disney umbrella? Is it worth a watch? I would say yes, but with some heavy caveats. I will say, this movie does a lot of the same things that the first film did. Visually, it is spectacular. Visually, it's gorgeous. The visuals are just incredible. Especially having watched the first movie recently again, and seeing how the CGI is still admirable and good, but for its time, it was perfect, and now some of it hasn't necessarily aged well. It's a beautiful film. The mocap performances are incredible. The amount of work that the team put into this film and the technology involved, it's an astonishing accomplishment, and it deserves all the praise that it gets. But where it falters is where the original film faltered in story. Now, I will say, in some regards, this film is stronger in the story department, but in others, it dips pretty far in quality, maybe even regresses a little bit. Both films were really good at dealing with big ideas, and for what it's worth, I did kind of get enamored in some of these big ideas. What it means to be human, what it means to be kind and empathetic, what's really valuable in life, what your values should be, honoring the planet, that sort of thing. But also big sci-fi ideas that I haven't seen really since like the 80s. And Avatar: The Way of Water does build on some of these big ideas from the first movie. Some of these interesting character developments, some of these interesting big sci-fi notions and concepts. And it's difficult to talk about without spoiling some of the movie's bigger plot points, so I won't do that. But for every big, interesting idea that this movie has, it takes some unfortunate steps back. I think that's mostly due to the fact that James Cameron came from an era of filmmaking that today we find somewhat problematic. And some of the storytelling notions that he has, along with his writing team, feel a bit dated, and not in the best way. Some characters in this movie, I don't think it's a spoiler to say, Neytiri in particular gets the shaft. Some of the storytelling decisions in the movie are very tropey, just seem very, I don't want to say lazy, but ill-informed, kind of tone-deaf decisions that you expect some movies to just not make. And I feel like what probably happened is that certain notions that James Cameron carried over from his heyday when he was making Aliens and The Abyss and True Lies and the Terminator movies, they just haven't particularly aged well. And I think it becomes evident as you watch the movie that for all its visual bluster and incredible sequences, it makes some very old mistakes and very strange backwards decisions with some of its characters and some of its sequences, and it was almost enough that sometimes it took me completely out of the story. Which is sad, because there are some things that happened in this movie that I was very happy to see, very cool storytelling decisions, but for every one or two, there's 3 or 4 that I had trouble with. I think that certain decisions made as far as world building is concerned, as far as motivations are concerned, as far as how these characters have aged in 13, 14 years and have spent their time from the first movie to now, don't make a lot of sense. And again, it's hard to talk about without spoiling it outright, but overall, it's a very mixed bag, which is sad to say, but at the same time, I'm not entirely surprised. There are moments where this sort of throwback attitude, this sort of nostalgic feel for 80s and 90s cinema works in the film's favor, but it's not enough, I think, to make up for the times that it shoots itself in the foot. It's unfortunate, but it's there. And for some people, I believe it will be probably hard to look past. But I don't think it overall ruins the film. It might be enough that some people won't come back for the sequels, and it is kind of worrisome that James Cameron not only insists on putting his foot in his mouth a lot lately about certain Hollywood trends and how he feels the movie industry should be moving forward and doing things, but also this notion that he has that the first 3 movies seem to be setting the stage for a lot more moving forward. And to think that we've been waiting what could be almost 20 years of setup, and we haven't actually gotten to the main course yet, as it were, that's a little alarming. That he is taking this long and hoping that people are still willing to come back to these films after so long. I just don't know how sustainable that is. And the response to that would be that never doubt James Cameron. Always trust in James Cameron. And I've got to say, despite the doubts that I do have, despite the things that I don't like, the man seems to know what he's doing on some level. I don't know that Avatar: The Way of Water will necessarily reach the same lofty heights that the first film had, or even break those records. I doubt it. But it will join the $1 billion club. It already has. And it shows no signs of stopping. And chances are that it will convince Disney to put forth the money for the third, which I believe the third is coming around no matter what. But maybe even so far as convincing Disney to go into the fourth and fifth films, possibly even beyond. Again, I think the movie is worth your time if you want to kill an afternoon. I think that it's a pretty barren January coming up, and Avatar will be a good way to spend your money at the movies. It's worth the popcorn, at least. And it is fun. It does have its moments, but I do believe that there are stronger films out there, obviously. I don't know that there are necessarily more beautiful films or more technically advanced, impressive films, but I do believe that overall Avatar: The Way of Water is a sort of middling, mixed bag, medium movie-going experience. I wish I could say differently. There's probably a lot to blame for that. The marketing campaign didn't do itself any favors. The amount of time it took to make, the overambitiousness perhaps of James Cameron and his writing team coming up with 2, then 3, then 4 sequels. It was just a lot for this film. But clearly something is working for people. And there are certainly worse movies out there. And being perfectly frank for a minute, it did work on me personally, reminding me of a time when I was a child and a lot more optimistic and a lot more passionate about my feelings on saving the planet, and no spoilers, but specifically the whales. And this definitely powered home a similar but different message than the first movie. And I am interested to see where the sequels take the story, because when this movie ends, there are certainly a lot of unanswered questions. And I suppose I will be there to see when they are answered. Anyway, friends, I think that's all for this episode. If you would like me to continue doing this and reviewing more movies, TV shows, digital releases, what have you, like and subscribe, click the bell, tell your friends, your family. The channel is seeing growth, and I'd like to continue the momentum if I can. And thank you all for hanging out and being here. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll be back with more soon. Anyway, friends, I'll see you later. Burn out.